Thank you. Thank you for having me as well. On my first day in Cambridge a week ago, I entered into the chapel of Jesus College, and it was a moment that stirred me to tears. The tears quickly dried when I started counting the number of arches to determine what kind of vault it is, because I teach my students back home about Gothic architecture. So this move from an enchantment found in the very corporeality of a space towards the abstractions of intellectual thought foreshadows the narrative arc of this talk. Now, enchantment defies a precise definition, but a reflection on my own personal experiences in landscapes especially reveals some shared characteristics of these precious moments. There's the feeling of something grabbing you, sometimes gently, sometimes more forcefully, from the other side of a physical place. Whether the other side is a memory, an imagined geography, a longing, or in the case of the chapel, God. The experience feels poetic, felt change of consciousness, to use Barfield's definition, and even transformative, if only for a moment. It makes you feel that you are giving something of yourself. I heard someone last week talk about, I think it was about the unselfing. This radiating beauty often feels incomplete and frustrating, for its source remains like the blue of mountains out of reach. Homer describes enchantment in the Odyssey as the effect of the song of good poets on their audience. Through song they impress truth, received as if from the tongues of gods. The listener is moved to a spellbound state wherein self-consciousness and worldliness is suspended. My desire to bring enchantment into the fold of landscape architecture led me to study the historic role of classical myth in gardens. This 4,000-year-old tradition of placemaking I call, inspired by Tolkien, classical topo-mythopoesis. The garden makers of this tradition employ three representational types to evoke the myths. Emblematic, like statues and inscriptions, morphological, like grottos and mounds, and natural, water springs, flowers, and so on. These together form the physical garden, itself perceived as a veridical place through what Barfield calls figuration. Now, following Barfield further down the line, the garden dweller encountering such a topo-myth need not be an innocent bystander perceiving an objective garden of representations out there, but can participate in its being by bringing an immaterial dimension to the material. And I'm using that word with some hesitancy, and I will certainly go and look into it. The garden dweller can look with imagination, with strings of an Aeolian harp stretched over their eyes. We'll know where that comes from. The immaterial dimension, I argue, is not the myths, but a myth land, like fairyland, a virtual Arcadia that exists within the imagination of the percipient. When we sense the immaterial mythland in the material garden, we experience enchantment as a type of beauty. So when the yellow circle, which is what I would call the virtual landscape of Arcadia, is brought in an act of participation to almost surround the phenomenal landscape as a radiating presence, then we feel enchantment. So this beauty of seeing the invisible in the visible is found in Plotinus. In my mind, I kept pronouncing it Plotinus. That's what's beneficial to come to places like this, where he describes the architect judging his creation as beautiful when the inner idea is stamped upon the mass of exterior matter, the indivisible exhibited in diversity. So the mythland of Arcadia functions as such an ideated, indivisible landscape that through its participation finds expression in the sensible garden. But it is not an inner idea conceived only by an individual architect, but is an inner world stitched together from the stories, paintings, emblem books, and today even films and video games, made by a historical and a contemporary collective of poet, theologians, and artists. That's the blue circle, which I call the dense representational network. Like Fairyland, its contents is both highly personal yet shared. So I'm using Fairyland as an example because
they had a 3-hour lunch.
Grown up on the story, the light, some glimmering idea of a place, but it is never represented. There was an artist, Bernard Sly, that tried to represent Fairyland, but it is something that exists within us, and we can share how it would look like or appear like it. Each would be different based on their exposure. When thus understood in Neoplatonic terms, the statues, the groves, and the flowers are not made to tell stories, but are fragments of Arcadia that invite our communion with it, in the same way that Plotinus describes how the fragmentary, sensible world can be brought into unity with the ideal forms by those that have cultivated their vision. As Arcadia itself is not the hypostasis of the divine mind or soul, I propose that it is, to use Tolkien's term, a sub-created version, not a copy, of the natural world when it is in a state of unity with the intelligible. For there the gods are revealed. It is an imagined landscape where the charismatic human face of the gods provides an intimacy with infinity. And the garden is an appropriate meeting place between sky and earth, for it is where the divine intellectual Zeus emanates the soul, Aphrodite. If I'm allowed to read Plotinus's interpretation of Plato's myth of the birth of Aphrodite in the garden of Zeus, in more literal than metaphorical terms. Now, the way in which Plotinus referred to the gods as anthropomorphic expressions of the hypostases of a Platonic universe, and not as actual beings of cultic veneration, is the very approach to the Greek myths that saved the tradition of classical mythopoiesis from Christian iconoclasm. For as the tide of paganism was receding in late antiquity, Christians destroyed many public statues to, using Barfield's language, abolish original participation, where the statue is viewed as a receptacle for its god in an act of idolatry. Yet Venus and Cupid, the gods of love, were later baptized into Christian gardens during the Middle Ages, for they had become hollowed of their divinity and reappropriated as allegorical figures, following the example of the Neoplatonists, especially Proclus. For he stated that it is the very strangeness and the obvious untruthfulness of the myths that is what allows us to be drawn into the world concealed by the material veil. To quote, "Symbols are not imitations of those things which they are symbols of." So that seems to be an important break that avoids idolatry. For example, Venus must not be interpreted at face value. For Plotinus, she was at the lower level, the guardian over marriage and sexual union, elsewhere describing her as a harlot, and at the same time, soul intermingled in sensible matter. And at a higher level, she dwells in heaven, where she is purely soul, communing upwards with intellect. So this conception of twofold Venus is how Boccaccio in the 14th century treats the goddess in his genealogy of the gods, wherein he distinguishes between Venus Magna as the celestial origin of love and earthly Venus, both meretrix, the harlot, the prostitute, and genetrix as the legitimate Christian role in procreation. Boccaccio understood this conception as a poetic expression of the truth, intuited by the poet-theologians of antiquity, like Homer, namely that there is a divine love above the perceptible world from which cascades all other loves, right down to the passions that stir within our bodies. This distinction is evident in his literary treatment of gardens. In this frontispiece to his Decameron, possibly drawn by himself, we see the framed garden from where the young Brigata told their famously debauched stories. In this garden, ordered and Christian, the statue of the goddess of love, in the fountain, prompts participation with an Arcadia wherein free love reigns under the powers of corporeal Venus. Boccaccio thus maintains a strict distinction between Christian Tuscany and pagan Arcadia, although the fountain is a point of convergence between the sensible and the imagined. Whereas the medieval inclusion of the gods of love in literary gardens function mostly as substitutive allegories, Venus equals love, Boccaccio allowed himself to render his mythland, his Arcadia, with a modicum of realism as a natural, living landscape enchanted by its numerous inhabitants. For example, in his comedy of the Florentine nymphs, he describes a lucus amuenus that allows Ametu and the reader to relish in the beauty of its appearances and sensory graces. Just to quote a small line, no sooner did he behold the shining ripples of the little river than he saw several young maidens sitting on the bright bank in the shade of saplings amongst highly grown grass and flowers. Ametu, enchanted by the natural sensual scene, is struck by the epiphanic beauty of the nymph Leah. Later, her allegorical identity as faith is revealed as she inspires Ametu's love to ascend from the carnal to the spiritual. So although he was still, as in the Middle Ages, drawing from the tropes of the lucus amuenus literary tradition, and also Dante's use of nymphs as allegories of virtue, his description of the landscape and its beings reads not like some tired, symbolic shorthand for love. Visible things are not used as mere tokens for invisible things because of their obvious resemblance, but are deemed to be, in a Neoplatonic sense, linked to a spiritual realm that can be revealed through epiphany. And Boccaccio was aware of this. For in the Decameron, after Loretta's song, at the end of day 3, wherein she links the beauty of her body and the beauty of divine love, the Brigata's reception is split. Those who interpret it as a simple allegory after the Milanese fashion, there was a hint of snobbery towards the north, and those cultivated enough to gaze beyond the sublunar world. So Boccaccio allows the faithful subject to indulge in the god-haunted, erotic landscape without concern that this voyeurism will corrupt their soul, or without fear of idolatry, since, as he states in his genealogy, the gods were untoothed by Christ. Boccaccio paved the way with his literature and his genealogy for the humanists of the 16th century in Italy to engage with gardens in a purely creative participation, conscious that Arcadia is sub-creative. And we can see it from this account of a garden, and it's quite rare to find first-hand accounts of garden experiences for this period in history, by Bartolomeo Taegiu from his book La Villa. As in Boccaccio, Taheju, his experience of a garden setting inhabited by statues, Venus and the sun, is far from an allegorical exegesis, as found in, say, the medieval Romance of the Rose. We cannot use here the words employed by garden historians to decipher what each element allegorizes, represents, or refers to. The spell that the garden casts over Taheju is achieved through an ensemble of various topomythopoeic statues and morphological types, working as a symphony of sensory and symbolic impressions. Things in the garden are not individual objects for focused contemplation or decoding. The atmosphere of the Lucis Amuinus is achieved by the fusion of nature and artifice, a third nature, as he calls it. Natural artificial elements of water, the rivulet, the fountain, plants that have been clipped in the form of a hedge, and contained animals, the playing fish, together with the artificial natural elements of the grotto and the anthropomorphic statues, the marble figures. So the somatic experience then moves only momentarily to the imagination, where an immaterial dimension is seen, where it says, "It seems to me there could be another world, and so sweet to me was this delusion that there is no certainty that compares with it." Conscious that this is a delusion, the delectable vision appears when Taheju is peering into the pool and seeing the reflection of the statues, revealing a vision of Venus. The strangeness that begets a change of consciousness is intensified by the change of light, for experiences this especially at dusk or dawn. This upward experience from the world of the senses to the intellect is captured in the move from hearing, soft murmur, seeing the fish, imagining the higher world, and then reasoning, where he starts saying, "I do not want to mingle fable with truth." A hierarchy of experience that strikingly follows the order of the influential Neoplatonist Marsilio Ficino's 5 pleasures, to quote, "of which the lowest is smelling, the higher in hearing, the more sublime in seeing, the more eminent in imagination, and the higher and more divine in the reason." The analogy of the pool as a well-polished mirror reflects the Neoplatonic mirror as being analogous with the imagination, which enabled the reflection of the higher ontological levels, yet is by no means world-denying. Jumping another 200 years, we can read from this guidebook to Wörlitzer Park in Germany, written by August Rode in 1788. And this passage is where he describes the temple of Venus, where we find a Neoplatonic echo of the heavenly Venus, which betrays a characteristic of the period that is not always acknowledged, namely the Platonism of German thinking from the mid-18th century onwards. The interest, as you will probably know, was sparked when philologists started reading Plato, amongst other ancient authors in their original languages. Amongst those who were drawn to him was Johan Winkelmann, whose thinking on aesthetics was informed by his reading of Plato. You will all know the famous ekphrasis of the Apollo statue. The writings of others influenced by the anti-materialism of Plato, like Rousseau, started gaining widespread influence in Europe as a counter-intellectual guard against Hobbes. Since the gardens at Wörlitz were influenced by Winkelmann's ideas and those of Rousseau, we may infer that its conception was, at least in part, Platonic. Neoplatonism served as a bridge between the opposing intellectual currents, which we also find in the Rode, of Romanticism and Enlightenment thinking. The stereotypical chasm between the emotionally charged Romantics and the rationally minded followers of the Enlightenment is overcome once we interpret the works of the Romantics through Platonic eyes. The aesthetic epiphany of viewing beauty grants access to a higher form of rationalism that goes beyond intellectual understanding towards intuitive reasoning. And we find something of this in Roeder, when the garden dweller momentarily a participant in an imagined mystic ritual. It comes after the visitor is guided through half-built grottos of Neptune and Aeolus, described as trials on the path to enlightenment, and comes to see the temple in full view. At that stage, still without its statue, which was added just after that aquatinta was made. And the view is then augmented by the imagination. Here, participation commences with the projection of an imagined Arcadia onto the scene, rather than it emerging from the sensory experience as in Taheju. And the image is that of some mystic initiation ritual in front of the statue, which conjures, perhaps deliberately, those, and it was mentioned earlier, hermetic theurgical rituals in the Renaissance, during which a statue was ensouled. This interpretation is not too far-fetched, since German Romanticism was in part influenced by a legacy of nature mysticism passed on by the Platonic Hermeticists, such as the Renaissance Paracelsus and the 17th century Jacob Boehme, mentioned earlier. By playing at partaking in ritual, the garden dweller's own soul is filled with spirit, and the body is filled by the somatic delight of viewing the landscape through the shadow lines of the fluted columns. The ecstatic aesthetic experience builds up towards an epiphanic catharsis. But, as Becker points out, the imminent appearance of the celestial Venus remains unfulfilled. Rather, the text shifts to a formal description of the statue as a mere work of art. To quote, "The statue in the center of the temple is a cast of the Venus de Medici. The corpus of the circular and hollow pedestal consists of yellow panes of glass set between thin iron rods. The cornice and the base are made of sandstone." So that's the conclusion that he leaves us with, rather soulless. The longing gaze of the romantic wanderer has been replaced by the descriptive eye of the art historian. The enchantment of encountering the heavenly goddess of love is broken when participation, harnessing the full power of the individual imagination, is interrupted by an analysis of a mere object, a plaster copy of a statue. I am back in Jesus' chapel counting the arches. Roeder's guide has veered in kind to that of Joseph Spence in England, who a few years before Roeder wrote a guidebook to his own garden called Polymetus, wherein he gives visitors guidance as to how to interpret the statues therein. And they become objects for analytical dissections. By 1800, there was in England a weariness for that kind of emblematic gardening that demanded them to be read like books or decoded like some Dan Brownian cipher. A weariness that played its part in the decline of classical topomythopoesis and the general disenchantment of landscape. So in conclusion, imagined Arcadia was made and is continually remade as a place existing on the resounding shore between our bounded earthly existence and an invisible ocean of transcendence. In the garden where we step into Arcadia, we become sub-creators, playing God by making God in our own fragile image. We play at breaking through the material veil, perhaps in the hope that something wholly other will break through from the other side. It is the kind of play that Plotinus in the third Ennead encourages as a means to cultivate our vision. Thank you.